I must say that the three HRs are extremely compelling. The next person doesn't really need an introduction to this crowd, but let me, in an obligatory way, read quickly the two paragraphs I have in front of me. Dr. Robert Carr has been active in the field of HIV since 2000, when he began research and advocacy on stigma and discrimination against people living with HIV in Jamaica, and then in 2002 became Executive Director of Jamaica AIDS Support for Life, a national NGO serving the most disenfranchised in Jamaican society, including prisoners, the hearing impaired, sex workers, and gay and other men who have sex with men. Since then, Dr. Carr has gone on to be co-founder of the Caribbean Vulnerable Communities Coalition, a coalition of Indigenous frontline service providers working on rights-based programming with marginalized groups across the Caribbean. He is co-chair of the Caribbean Vulnerable Communities Coalition and Director of Policy and Advocacy at the International Coalition of AIDS Services Organizations. And if you will permit me exercising the so-called rights of the moderator, just to say a personal word, Robert Carr has become a dear and trusted and good friend, and he's become much more than that for me. He's become a mentor against whose views I can measure my own instincts and always have my principles strengthened after a conversation with Robert. When Robert came not long ago to our home, because he's now based in Toronto, and we had an evening with the family, the entire family was, I think, collectively charmed and smitten simultaneously. I want you to welcome Robert as he deserves to be welcomed, but I beg you to exercise compassion. He is shaking uncontrollably. He hasn't had his BlackBerry for 2 hours. Robert.
Thank you. Well, all of that is a hard act to follow, including my introduction, but I'm going to try. I don't know where to start. There are so many issues that have been raised over the course of today, and I find myself really reflecting on the discrepancy between the kinds of conversations that we've been having over the course of today and all that we know, all that we have been affirming, all that we've been discovering, and the discrepancy between that and the way in which the rest of this week is going to unfold, and the assumptions behind the way the rest of this week is going to unfold. And I didn't start out outraged, but after listening to the presentations this evening, I'm really concerned about the implications for what we're going to do in this conference, and beyond that, what we're going to do with this epidemic, and beyond that, the fundamental assumptions that are undergirding the way in which countries are run, that are in fact driving the epidemic, so the epidemic becomes a symptom of the dysfunction of the way that societies are being run. And I want to frame my remarks in that regard. I stand here bolstered by the picket behind me, with the claims for human rights for all. I'm going to come back to that image in a few moments at the end of my brief remarks. The next slide, please. One of the things that I think we have to go into this conference demanding, is that HIV programs for MSM must target social inclusion and focus on key institutions. And by key institutions, I'm talking about institutions like these. Now, you notice I haven't put the National AIDS Control Program, because I think the narrowing of the focus of what needs to happen to a National AIDS Control Program, even where that National AIDS Control Program has become enlightened after years of advocacy, is quite frankly bullshit, and it is completely unacceptable, and we have to refuse to be constrained to a small department in a ministry while the rest of the government arrests us, the rest of the government refuses to acknowledge our partnerships, the rest of the government refuses to acknowledge the need for people to be able to visit their loved ones when they're sick, because all of those things conspire to ensure that the work that we're doing to reduce the infections will never be effective. They will never be effective. We have got to break this mindset that says that gathering 20 or 30 or 50 of us into a room and teaching us how to put a condom onto a dildo is doing anything to address the raging epidemics that are going on across the world. It is bullshit, and we have to call it bullshit, and we have to let people know that we will not stand by and let them get away with this anymore. Next one. Now, part and parcel of what's going to happen when we start saying that this is bullshit and insufficient is that we're going to start to hear about religious values, religious principles, the importance of morality and a good society, and that in a good society, the kind of indifference that we're experiencing is in fact appropriate because that's what's good for the nation. We also have to demonstrate the extent to which that is bullshit. Many of us are coming from countries where, as part of our independence movements, there was all kinds of rhetoric about power to the people, about inclusion, about a new way of working, about Master's Day being done. Yet somehow when it comes to our populations, all of that gets parked to the side. Somehow on those populations, the kind of brutality that police, for example, used to mete out to subjugated populations, somehow that's appropriate behavior when it comes to us. And parliamentarians feel like they have a right to stand up in Parliament, in the media, and to make these kinds of statements, and somehow it will not, it will pass and it will not be confronted. That has to stop. There are too many fora in which governments are making agreements, are making commitments on the basis of principles of decency and fair relations and honesty and the rest of it, and somehow the way in which they treat our communities is exempted from all of that, and that bullshit has got to stop as well. The idea that homosexuality is a Western invention is also bullshit that has got to stop. There are too many of us in this room and who are in their home countries, who are living gay lives, who are the recent generation, the upcoming generation, who know people generations before them who have been gay in their communities for decades, and somehow that is invisible. That has to stop. The idea that that invisibility is part of national purity has to stop. We have to find ways to be heard. We have to find ways to confront that kind of strategic silencing of our historical and indigenous presence in societies all over the world, including the developing world. I think one of the most important institutions, and I stand with the others, with Shiv, who asked where was the UN on this 5 years ago. I started CVC about, how long ago was that, 6, 7 years ago? And one of the first things I tried to do was to work with the UN around homophobia and homosexuality. A UN agency gave me $10,000, $10,000, which is not a lot of money in a UN budget, I promise you. And they told me to do with it what I pleased. I had a regional meeting for about 45 gay, lesbian, and transgender people. They didn't speak to me for the next year. That bullshit also has to stop. The UN is premised on issues of democracy, on good government, on social inclusion, yet somehow they've taken a back seat. Now, UNDP has been leading the charge, trying to make a difference, as has UN AIDS. And we're very lucky to have people like Mandeep, like Richard, and others who are here, who are pushing the UN system to behave differently. But these are global level advocates. And the bottom line is the UN needs to step up at country level. There needs to be some accountability so that when people refuse to take on the issues of homophobia, when people refuse to take on the failure of the national program to deal with this, and the failure of governments to hold the national program accountable to this, that somehow the silence is appropriate and the UN becomes complicit with that, and that has also got to stop. It is bullshit. My last point. None of this can work unless civil society has the funds and the resources to move. I spent 10+ years working in the Caribbean with advocates trying to address this issue. And 99% of those people were volunteers. There is no money. With all the billions available for AIDS alone, there is no money to support the work that we all know needs to be done. The idea is that somehow as community members who are invested in change, we're supposed to do it for free or find a job and volunteer on the side, and that's how things should happen, and that's appropriate. We'll give you a box of condoms, we'll give you a peer education workshop, and that's how you're going to move forward. That has got to stop. We have got to let it be known in this conference over the next coming week that that is bullshit, that the resources that are there have to be found and have to be applied to what we already know is works. As in the Caribbean, we talk about spinning a top in mud. We have got to stop letting people give us the short end of the stick. We have to confront them. We have to say enough is enough. And we have to hold the institutions, the donor institutions, the bilateral institutions, the UN, to account about whether or not all of this money and all of this effort and all of this rhetoric about human rights is actually making a difference for communities on the ground in the countries where the epidemic is raging. Okay. So, thank you. My last point. So I want to just end with a story that I find very inspirational. Some of you may know about the work that's been going on in Jamaica for the past, 10 years plus. But about 6 years ago, some of you may have heard about the campaign against homophobic music. And you may also have heard about the Human Rights Watch report. That was the beginning of a struggle to end the complicity of silence around the brutality and the driving out of homes of gay men across Jamaica. People had to do it in silence. People had to hide and do it. The only person who actually was permanently employed or fully employed to do this had to have a fake name because it was so dangerous that we could not allow that person's identity to become known. 6 years later, what this picture shows is that JFLAG, the Jamaica Forum for Lesbians, Homosexuals, and Gays, with the support of AIDS-Free World, was able to hold a public demonstration in partnership with human rights organizations, in partnership with members of the media on the other side of those placards, holding those placards, and with other partners in a coalition to stand up in rush hour traffic on a weekday morning and say that gay people in Jamaica are here, that they are part of the nation and the national dialogue, and they have a right to speak out and to do so in public. Now, I am thrilled that a number of people in that coalition are here today, and I want to end by asking them to stand up and be acknowledged for the brilliant work that they have done over all these years. Dane, please stand up. Maurice, Tony, Ivan, Jermaine. This is a testament to what happens when we have a commitment of spirit, when we are determined at whatever cost to change the way societies think about gay people. If it can happen on the streets of Kingston, it can happen anywhere. But it has to happen with support. So one more time, enough of this bullshit, no more rhetoric over the course of the next few days. We have got to push the people who come next week to really take action on what we all know needs to be done. Thank you very much.